Testing, testing, testing.
The committee will come to order. I want to welcome all of you to the markup of the Russia and Moldova Jackson-Vanik Repeal Act of 2012. With unemployment stuck above 8%, we can't miss any opportunity to help create jobs and expand our exports. This bill is such an opportunity. That's why this legislation enjoys such broad bipartisan support, and I'm pleased that Ranking Members Levin and McDermott, as well as other members of the committee, joined Chairman Brady and myself in sponsoring this bill. This bipartisan support was on full view last week when the Senate Finance Committee unanimously passed the identical bill, save for one provision that falls outside of our jurisdiction, the Magnitsky bill, which I expect to be added at rules. There's no question that Russia will join the WTO on August 22nd. The economic benefits of Russia's new membership in the WTO are also clear: greater opportunities for U.S. employers, farmers, and ranchers to sell American goods and services to Russia because Russia has to lower its barriers to join. To obtain the benefits of the concessions that Russia made to join the WTO, we must pass this bill and grant Russia PNTR. Otherwise, all of these benefits will go to our foreign competitors. We give up nothing with this legislation, not a single U.S. tariff, but we would obtain a powerful new enforcement tool and important rights with respect to the sixth largest economy in the world. I recognize the challenges of our relationship with Russia. We have significant, long-standing bilateral commercial issues relating to enforcement and protection of intellectual property rights and the application of certain sanitary and phytosanitary requirements to our agricultural products. Many of these issues should be resolved as Russia adopts WTO's rules. However, there are concerns over whether Russia will live up to its WTO obligations and its willingness to resolve those issues that fall outside of the WTO. This bill addresses these concerns by making sure that the administration stays on top of Russia's compliance with its WTO commitments, tackling our long-standing trade issues with Russia, and addressing the lack of the rule of law in Russia. Many members are also concerned with the significant problems that Russia poses relating to foreign policy and human rights. I share these concerns, and that's why I support adding the Magnitsky legislation to this bill before it's considered by the House. And finally, this legislation grants PNTR to Moldova. Moldova acceded to the WTO in 2001, so this step is long overdue. And before I yield to the ranking member for any statement he wishes to make, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record. And without objection so ordered, Mr. Levin.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Mr. Reif. You've been here before, and we're glad you're here again. Since our hearing on this issue in June, action within the control of Congress has improved. Those of us who have been pressing for a bill that seeks to strengthen enforcement are pleased that our efforts came to fruition in work on a bipartisan basis with the Senate Finance Committee and its markup last week. Action within the control of Russia, most directly that related to Syria, has unfortunately not changed enough. As we know, as the chairman said, failing to grant PNTR does not prevent Russia from joining the WTO. They are scheduled to do so on August 22, and our government has agreed to their accession agreement. Failing to act only prevents U.S. companies, workers, and farmers from gaining the benefits of Russia's WTO membership. There are serious outstanding trade issues we have with Russia, ranging from IPR enforcement to the rule of law. Russia's WTO membership will help us to make progress on some of these issues. But at the same time, Russia's accession will not by itself fully solve these problems. We will need to continue to work actively to address these issues at every opportunity. For example, without PNTR, if Russia would decide to massively subsidize a key industry, and those subsidies harm U.S. exporters, there is nothing we can do about it today. But with PNTR, we would be able to challenge those subsidies and either remove them or face WTO sanctioned retaliation by the U.S. The bill before us today is much improved on enforcement in what was an original bill, so-called clean bill. Among other things, it requires the administration to report on Russia's implementation of all of its WTO commitments and to describe the administration's plan to address any deficiency. It establishes also a new mechanism to gather and report information on bribery and corruption in Russia. And it requires the administration to negotiate new agreements to address long-standing issues with IPR enforcement and barriers to U.S. agricultural exporters. I would like to submit now for the record an exchange of letters between Mr. McDermott and myself and the USTR on the use of Section 301. A bill introduced in the Senate by Senator Sherrod Brown and in the House by Representatives Michaud and Delora provides that the Ways and Means Committee has the right to request that the administration take action regarding Russia's compliance. I favor such a mechanism. Upon further examination, it is clear that existing law, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, already provides, and I quote, any interested person, end of quotes, the right to petition for such an enforcement action. This week, we exchanged letters with USTR confirming that Section 301 already enables the Ways and Means Committee to request action and requires USTR to respond within a fixed timeline. I ask that that be submitted for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
In addition to our ongoing efforts around enforcement, we also need to do more as a committee and as a Congress and as individual members on the issues of human rights in Syria. So I urge the House leadership to work with us on this committee and the other committees of jurisdiction to nail down three things. Number one, work with Senate leadership to reconcile the differences between the House and Senate Magnitsky bills as soon as possible. Two, after resolution of differences, confirm that the Magnitsky bill and the PNTR bill will be joined together before any action on the House floor. And number three, determine how best we can send a clear message through report language and other steps to Russia that it needs to work with the other nations of the world to address the violence against civilians in Syria. Mr. Chairman, I will appreciate your willingness to work on these issues on a bipartisan basis.
All right, thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6156, the Russia and Moldova Jackson-Vanik Repeal Act of 2012, which was distributed in advance along with a section-by-section summary. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now turn to Ms. Angela Ellard, Committee Chief Trade Counsel and Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Trade, to provide the technical description of H.R. 6156, and I would ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Levin. In the interest of time, I'll summarize just the key provisions. Title I, Section 102 of H.R. 6156 authorizes the President to determine that Title IV of the Trade Act of 1974, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, should no longer apply to Russia and to proclaim the extension of permanent normal trade relations, PNTR, with Russia. The effective date is no sooner than the effective date of the accession of Russia to the WTO, which is now scheduled for August 22nd. Title II, Section 1 requires USTR to report annually on implementation, specifically the extent to which Russia is implementing the WTO agreement, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, and the TRIPS agreement regarding intellectual property rights. In addition, USTR is required to report on progress by Russia in acceding to and the extent to which Russia is implementing the Information Technology Agreement and the Agreement on Government Procurement. If Russia is not fully implementing an agreement or making adequate progress in acceding to an agreement, USTR is required under Section 201 to describe the actions that it will take. USTR is also required to report annually describing enforcement actions by USTR against Russia to ensure full compliance with its obligations. Section 202 of the bill requires USTR and state to report annually on measures taken by the administration and results achieved with respect to improving the rule of law. In particular, negotiating a bilateral investment treaty, advocating for U.S. investors, including investors in the Yukos Oil Company, encouraging all signatories to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention to fully implement their commitments, promoting a customs administration, tax administration, and judiciary in Russia that are free of corruption, increasing cooperation to expand civil society in Russia to address corruption. The Secretary of Commerce is also required to maintain a phone hotline and secure website to allow U.S. entities to report instances of bribery and to seek U.S. assistance. Section 203 requires that the already existing annual National Trade Estimate Report include a section to identify and analyze any Russian law, policies, or practices that deny fair and equitable market access to U.S. digital trade. Section 204 requires USTR to continue to pursue the reduction of barriers to trade imposed by Russia through efforts to negotiate a bilateral equivalency agreement with respect to sanitary and phytosanitary standards so that Russia would recognize U.S. SPS standards as equivalent to Russian standards. In addition, USTR is to continue its efforts to obtain an action plan to provide for greater protection for U.S. intellectual property rights than required under WTO rules. And finally, Title III authorizes the President to determine that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment should no longer apply to Moldova and to proclaim the extension of PNTR with an effective date as soon as the President makes the determination. Moldova acceded to the WTO exactly 11 years ago today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Ms. Ellard. In addition, Mr. Timothy Reif, General Counsel with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, is also here to answer any questions members may have. Are there any questions? And I'll first turn to Mr. Levin.
I don't at this time.
All right. Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ellard, I'm glad Russia has made a number of commitments to open up its market as part of joining the WTO. It's certainly beneficial to make Russia part of the WTO rules-based trading system. They're the largest economy in the world not to be part of this. However, I also don't fault members for having doubts about Russia living up to these commitments. This is particularly true given the challenges of getting Russia to comply with its commitments in past bilateral arrangements. Could you please explain to the committee how some provisions of this bill will help ensure that Russia will live up to its new commitments under the WTO?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Brady. The language that's before the committee today is designed to make sure that USTR stays in close touch with Congress to ensure implementation by Russia and taking steps towards enforcement if that is not the case. Section 201 of the bill, Section 202, and Section 203, and Section 204 all contain provisions that focus specifically on things like intellectual property, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, digital trade, also with respect to all of the commitments that Russia has made as part of its accession package, in addition to the commitments that it takes on as a WTO member through the agreements. So those are the mechanisms that would require reporting by USTR, not only on the steps that Russia is taking, but if Russia is lacking in any way, the steps that USTR is taking to address those.
And in these areas, these products and services in technology and agriculture and those types of services, we don't have the ability to enforce commitments today from Russia. Although we grant them normal trading relationship year after year after year, these are new commitments, new obligations that we're able to enforce because of their joining the WTO.
Yes, that's correct. These new commitments, and in addition to that, the enforcement mechanism that we have to make sure that Russia lives up to them.
And Mr. Reif, do we have the administration's commitment that you'll comply with the letter and spirit of these requirements.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I want to underscore Ms. Ellard's answer that there are a number of new tools that the legislation provides to the administration, as well as the tools that we have under existing law that will enable us to enforce effectively the commitments once Russia joins the WTO. So we feel that the bill itself, as well as our abilities under existing law, provide us a strong basis, a strong tool set to ensure that these commitments are fulfilled.
Great. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Sure, Mr. Levin.
Just a quick follow-up. Mr. Reif, why don't you briefly explain how 301 would operate if the committee asked the administration, USTR, to act?
Sure. Under Section 301, the committee, as we've confirmed, would have the opportunity to present a petition to USTR if there was a matter that the committee felt was not, where Russia was not acting consistently with its WTO commitments. USTR would examine the petition and would respond within a period of either the 45 to 60 days, or if it needed a little extra time, and indicate if it felt that the commitment was being fulfilled, or to move ahead to take some form of action if it felt that the commitment was not being fulfilled.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this bill to grant PNTR to Russia, and I want to talk about some specific steps that we're taking in the bill today. Russia is acceding to the WTO. Congress has nothing whatsoever to say about that. All we can do here in the committee is decide the terms on which the United States will participate with Russia under the WTO rules. The most important problem we need to deal with on Russia is enforcement. Solid enforcement mechanisms are essential and accountable for trade obligations because they must be fully enforced. This bill does exactly that. The bill has strong anti-bribery and anti-corruption provisions. It has the necessary mechanisms to enforce our intellectual properties and our information technology. We've made significant success in breaking down Russian barriers to agricultural trade, but this bill calls for USTR to do more. When it comes to enforcement, this is truly a 21st century agreement. But that's not all. Under existing law, if Congress does not think the agreement is being lived up to, this committee can take action. Some have said that repealing the Jackson-Vanik provision, which the bill does, will weaken our human rights and labor rights levers with Russia. That's simply not true. For one thing, Congress has not used that provision against Russia for nearly 20 years. And the major human rights groups want to move past Jackson-Vanik, which focuses on immigration barriers faced in the former USSR. Instead, this bill will be coupled with the Magnitsky provisions, which focus on the real problems of Russia today. Those provisions put real sanctions on those individuals who are complicit in human rights violations. This is a serious policy upgrade and a big win for human rights around the world. And finally, Russia's entry into the WTO should create real jobs here in the United States by drastically lowering tariffs to the U.S.-made goods and services. The tariffs on IT are completely eliminated. Russia's aircraft, chemical, and pharmaceutical tariffs are heavily reduced. That means real job growth around the country in the coming years. In many ways, this agreement is one-sided to our benefit. Our tariffs are not going down, but Russia's are. Russia's going to exceed anyways. But with the agreement, we are going to see effective enforcement with Russia go up. And with the addition of the Magnitsky provisions, human rights and labor rights scrutiny and enforcement are getting a big boost. In many ways, Mr. Chairman, the Russians are not being our friends or responsible actors on the world stage. I'm particularly concerned about their abhorrent behavior on behalf of the Assad dictatorship in Syria. With this agreement in place, the ties that bind us will grow, and we will get more traction with them on other international issues in the future. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Reif, could you talk about the further barriers in agricultural exports and imports that we need, that you're going to be working on?
Mr. McDermott, for sure. One of the areas that we will be focused on continuing on a continuing basis and have a new opportunity and a new tool under Russia's accession to the WTO is in the area of sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. These have been significant issues going forward. Russia has undertaken a substantial number of commitments through its protocol of accession to the WTO.
Mr. Reif, give an example to the committee of what a phytosanitary barrier is. How does that work?
Sure.
So we understand what we're getting in this bill.
Sure. A phytosanitary barrier, an illegitimate phytosanitary barrier, is where a country would say that a food product, for example, from another country is not safe for reasons that are not based on science, on sound science. So, for example, one of the new tools that we will have through the WTO is that there are actually rules that Russia will have to live up to on these so-called sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. Russia has already put into place for the first time a regime for adopting these kinds of rules, adopting international standards where there are international standards, which is enormously important as we work with Russia to try to improve their compliance in this critical area.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of our time.
Thank you. Mr. Reif, Mr. Levin, Senator Baucus, and Senator Hatch and I sent a letter to Ambassador Kirk last October urging you to insist that Russia meet high standards with regard to the negotiations about their accession to the WTO. And that letter raised concerns about their protection of intellectual property rights, its commitment to join the Information Technology Agreement, the unscientific and opaque sanitary and phytosanitary standards, as well as its auto investments policy. And we said that those issues would be significant considerations when Congress voted to remove Russia from Jackson-Vanik. And in your view, will Russia be in compliance with its WTO commitments when it becomes a member on August 22nd? And does this bill give USTR, I think as others have asked, the tools to ensure that Russia complies with those commitments?
Mr. Chairman, we do expect Russia to be in compliance with its WTO obligations. Just this morning, for example, Russia published on its website the full tariff schedule that it intends to adhere to upon accession, which include all of the ITA tariff commitments that it is undertaking as it joins the Information Technology Agreement. So we do expect that full compliance. At the same time, as we've been discussing, if we will remain on alert, we will continue to investigate and monitor Russia's compliance, and where we find problems, we won't hesitate to examine them, raise them with Russia directly, and take whatever steps may be required. And we can do so now with the additional trade enforcement unit that the President has created, which gives us additional resources at USTR to be able to monitor and to be able to find out about these problems at an early stage and seek to resolve them.
All right, thank you. Mr. Neal is recognized. Oh, okay. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to join with you and the ranking member as an original co-sponsor of the legislation we're considering today. I think my colleagues have outlined the reasons that we move forward. We all know that unless we extend PNTR status, our companies, farmers, workers will not fully benefit. We risk virtually nothing. We've highlighted the several enforcement tools that are provided in the legislation, which I appreciate. These requirements, coupled with the authority we have under Section 301 to request WTO cases, provide more effective tools. They're not perhaps all that one would want. They're not perfect, but they are more effective tools to ensure that the United States benefits from this agreement. I've listened respectfully to the various critics to this proposal, and I must confess that I'm reminded of the sheriff in Blazing Saddles, who, when confronted with an unruly crowd, just says, if you take one more step, I'm going to shoot the sheriff, as he puts a gun to his head. I mean, the simple fact is we don't have tools now that move us forward. Under this agreement, we do. As has been pointed out, Congress has not used Jackson-Vanik for more than 20 years. It doesn't help us. It doesn't achieve the objectives. It's the symbolism, I think, if anything, underscores futility and doesn't help us with Russia. This set of proposals moves us forward. It's going to make a difference in my state. I think it's going to make a difference for the American economy. And as has been referenced, It's going to help us readjust the relationship with Russia, which has been a roller coaster over time. But all of us remember when it was much, much worse than it is now, and that conditions are better in Russia than they have been in our lifetime. Mr. Reif, I wonder if you could help me just for a moment with one issue. Some of the stakeholders favor enforcement provisions of another bill, H.R. 6149. I wonder if you could explain the differences between the two, compare and contrast them.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer, and I'd be happy to do so. Actually, the provisions in the bill that the committee is marking up this morning are actually significantly stronger and go a good deal farther than those in the other legislation. Let me outline where there are strong commitments and where H.R. 6156, the bill that's before the committee, is stronger. First, there is an annual report required on Russian compliance, which I think Ms. Ellard mentioned, under this bill as well as the other legislation. There's an annual report on actions by USTR to promote Russian WTO compliance. That's common to both bills. There is a public hearing and comment period for the private sector to come and talk to USTR about those commitments. That's common to both bills. There is the ability of the committees to request action, which is common to both bills, action by USTR in response to potential problems. And finally, there is a report on what actions USTR has taken to enforce the legislation, common to both bills. But the legislation that the committee has before it, the PNTR legislation, actually goes significantly further. It requires that USTR negotiate an agreement to reduce regulatory barriers to U.S. agricultural exports, as we were discussing a moment ago with Mr. McDermott, which is not required by the alternate legislation. Section 204 of this bill requires that. Section 204 of the legislation you have before you also requires that we negotiate additional intellectual property enforcement measures with Russia. That's not required by the other legislation. Section 202, as Ms. Eller described, of the legislation before you requires that we take further steps to promote the rule of law, in particularly in the anti-corruption area. That's not required by the other legislation that you mentioned. And finally, the Section 203 of the bill before you requires an annual identification of digital barriers of market access, which is also not contained in the other legislation. So as I said at the beginning, we feel that this bill provides the strongest package of enforcement measures for us as USTR to move forward and ensure full compliance once Russia joins the WTO.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief, but I do want to commend you for trying to move Russia PNTR and the repeal of Jackson-Vanik forward. I am supportive of it, but I and some other members in the committee and also in this Congress have expressed some concerns that we are moving forward on this without any language of any kind, whether it's report or otherwise, in regards to Russia's position as it relates to Russia, Iran, and Syria right now, which are two of the hottest spots in the globe right now. And needless to say, the Russian cooperation with us and the rest of the international community has been lacking. After meetings with NSA and state and others from the administration, they made a convincing and compelling case that this is not the leverage point that can be used successfully in that regard. But nevertheless, I feel we'd be remiss today in markup or in moving this forward that at least some voices weren't expressing concern in regards to Russia's position on two of the most crucial areas of our foreign policy and national security now as it relates to Iran and Syria. Obviously, Mr. Rice, Ms. Eller laid out the sanitary and phytosanitary standards that are being applied here with Russia's ascension to WTO, but we've also had difficulty with them in the past as it relates to beef and pork and poultry and now dairy, which has effectively been shut out of the Russian market since September of 2010, losing tremendous market access right now, and we need it the most. After meetings with USDA and USTR, they've assured us that there are ongoing conversations in regards to the phytosanitary standards and what Russia will hopefully have to live up to. but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I guess I'd like to ask Mr. Reif on that front alone in regards to the potential of increased agricultural exports and the fact that Russia has been very difficult on this front for some time. And obviously, given my parochial interest in Wisconsin and the fact that dairy now is shut out of the Russian market since September of 2010, what are the prospects of ongoing successful negotiations with Russia to get them to open up that market again for enhanced export opportunities from our end?
Thank you, Mr. Kind. And we are working, let me say three things. We are continuing to work with Russia in that particular area, in the dairy area, as well as in some other areas. But second, for the first time when Russia joins the WTO, we will now not just have the opportunity to dialogue with them, but we will have the opportunity, if dialogue fails, to move to the next step, which would be enforcement. We recently took an SPS case, a case involving sanitary barriers with India, just in the last few months. So we're prepared, and with the President's Trade Enforcement Center, that will give us an even earlier opportunity to find out an early warning system to detect these problems, and when they can't be resolved, it'll give us more of an ability to move more quickly to address them if necessary through the dispute settlement mechanisms of the WTO. So we feel that we have a much better position once Russia's in the WTO to address these problems if they're not resolved through dialogue.
And I look forward to working with the administration as we move forward. And the dairy industry itself has been engaged in these conversations to see if progress can be made. But again, only time will tell. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and thank you for also the concerns you've raised. Some of them are outside the jurisdiction of this committee, although Mr. Levin and I are working on report language with respect to the Syria issue to attach to this as it goes forward. Mr. Reichert. Yes.
Mr. Camp and I are doing that, and we want to circulate it. And we'll do so today, right?
We hope to. I think we have some ideas that have been back and forth, so I think we're making progress.
Because the actions or the inaction of Russia as to Syria isn't before this committee in a formal sense. It isn't within our jurisdiction. But I think we've expressed it before on both sides that we feel a personal obligation to do whatever we can to make it clear how not only unsatisfactory, unwarranted, untenable is Russia's resistance to action by the family of nations. And we'll continue to work in that direction, and one way to express ourselves will be through report language.
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Reichert's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No question, just a brief comment. As the sponsor of Moldova PNTR, I am pleased that the long overdue graduation of Moldova from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment is included in this bill. Granting permanent normal trade relations status to Moldova will foster the trade relationship between our nations, allowing the United States to exercise all of its rights under the World Trade Organization with respect to Moldova and encourage ongoing Moldovan reforms to create a lasting democracy and a market economy. It is my hope that we can move forward on this legislation with broad bipartisan support and give the U.S. Businesses the opportunity to fully benefit from the membership of Russia and Moldova in the World Trade Organization, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, putting language in the report is not good enough. This is a very serious matter, and today this body is going to reward bad behavior, hoping that it will become better behavior. That's where it's at. I've heard the leverage point being used on our trade deals. It's beyond that. Right now, as we speak, and we discuss this legislation here, children are being killed, women are being killed, men are being killed by weapons supplied by Russia, and they continue to do this. We have seen their bad behavior. We have seen them, with two other countries, veto the measures before the United Nations. They have not assisted us. And if we think that this brings us closer to them being of assistance in the Middle East, all we're doing is strengthening the Syrian government, and all we're doing is strengthening the relationship between Syria and Iran, which is the closest partner to Syria in that region. this legislation has a lot of good things in it, and the work that the Trade Commission has done is exemplary. This is the wrong time for this. We need to have Russia straighten up and fly straight. The WTO can only work if everyone plays by the rules. Many people sitting in that position over there told us in past years, Russia will now follow the rules. Once a country gets through the doors, they soon forget about the commitments they've made. You know it, and I know it. I'm pleased that this bill will be joined with legislation, which many of us are co-sponsors of the Magnitsky bill, to replace Jackson-Vanik with more modern human rights legislation. Human rights is not simply a term to either Democrats or Republicans. It must mean something. It is not an addendum item. It is not a footnote when we make it that and simply talk about putting language into a report. We do ourselves a disservice. We strengthen and embolden those people who seek us harm. In this area, I strongly believe this legislation falls very short, namely Russia's actions as it relates to this humanitarian crisis and ongoing civil war. The Human Rights Commission says 19,000, not 15,000, 19,000 have been killed in these last 18 months. And if you say, and I understand you clearly, I think, that this has nothing to do with what we're discussing today, then we've really got off the deep end. We've really gone off the deep end. We are rewarding bad behavior. They have a long history, the Russians, of providing political and material support for the regime of President Assad, including selling him weapons, which he is now using against his own people. People of Syria have lived under his oppressive regime, Mr. Assad's, for far too long. Instead of hearing their calls early last year for political reform, he began a brutal campaign. While they've been selling the Assad regime the weapons they've used to prosecute this campaign, they've stymied all attempts by our government to see a peaceful resolution through the United Nations. And I know we tend to compartmentalize in the Congress of the United States, but I don't see how you can disassociate the behavior of the country of Russia, not the Russian people, its government, in terms of what we're dealing with today. I tell you, Mr. Chairman, it's poor timing, and we are rewarding. I know Russia will become part of the WTO regardless of what we do today. We understand that. But I think we send the wrong message. I think we're so anxious to run to the edge to say that we are pro-trade and we are for free trade and we want certain favoritism to be shown to certain countries, and that's our prerogative, of course. I think we're missing the whole point, and we've lost our way. We have lost our way. I'm glad Russia wants to join the world, WTO, and become a member of the international economic community. But there are not the actions of a prospective responsible leader in the community of nations. We need, as many of the trade unions have suggested, we need enhanced enforcement provisions. That's been our main problem with many of the trade deals that we have. Good deals, but they do not have the teeth when they provide for, or if they provide for, enhanced enforcement provisions. I believe that Russia needs to cease its support, Mr. Chairman, of Assad. I think it's very germane to what we're talking about today, and not, as some would say, not germane.
All right, thank you. Time has expired. I do have a letter written to the President of the United States, as well as the Speaker of the House and the Minority Leader of the House and the Majority Leader in the Senate and Minority Leader of the Senate, from the governors of Alabama, Arkansas, California, Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Iowa, Michigan, Mississippi, North Dakota, South Carolina, South Dakota, Utah, Vermont, and Washington, asking that we approve before the August congressional recess legislation to graduate Russia from Jackson-Vanik and establish PNTR with Russia, and I would ask unanimous consent that this be made part of the record. Without objection, so ordered. I also have a list of the Coalition for U.S.-Russia Trade, which is a 4-page list of diverse organizations such as the Business Software Alliance, the California Chamber of Commerce, companies like Xerox and Procter & Gamble, associations like the American Farm Bureau and the National Milk Producers, and I would also ask unanimous consent to insert that in the record, and without objection, so ordered. There being no further questions, are there any amendments to H.R. 6156? There being no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 6156 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6156 is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives, and without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.